Where to start? Um, Look, I've written bits and pieces over the years. They're not probably things that a lot of people know about, but I helped edit my school magazine in the mid-'60s. I wrote some things for Lot's Wife, the Monash student magazine back in the early 70s, when it really had some substance, not like the wanky little thing it is now. Although the times were a bit different then because it was the height of the Vietnam War and things like that. And basically, last October, I basically left teaching after 44 years. I've taught, for those that some people know, but I taught probably everywhere and everything. High school, technical school, TAFE, university, some tutoring. But I got to a stage where I just couldn't handle the marking anymore, especially teaching international students. It was doing my head in reading that Asianized English, but I think I had enough. I think, my daughter, who's a psychologist, kept saying, you'll know when the time is to go. And I kept saying, how will I know? And she said, you'll know. Well, the last couple of years, probably I thought about it, and the time came last October. So the day after Simplest Torah, I went in for my last day. And then I actually did spend a lot of the rest of the year going over this book, correcting a lot of the corrections of the professional editors. There was a lot of mistakes made, and it was it took a lot of effort, a lot of time. Still not perfect, but at least we managed to get it out just before the restrictions came in. So that's a good thing.
Yeah. And so where this idea for the book, where'd that come from?
Okay. Well, it's a bit like a lot of my teaching and a lot of things. You end up not doing what you intended to do, or you do the opposite. Look, I went back to Monash in 2008 or something to do some research and study into sort of Poland between the wars. Like, I want to know more about my parents' background, but by sheer coincidence, because of the way the units are taught into every second sort of semester, the stuff I wanted to do wasn't going. So I did some other studies, and then somehow I ended up in this new course, master's course about the Holocaust and genocide, which wasn't only about horrible things. There was other Jewish history and philosophy and literature involved there. And I got a bit tired of just reading books, summarizing, writing essays. It was, I did pretty well. It was pretty good, but I guess, at my age, that wasn't that much of a challenge. And I think the tutors picked that up. And so I was asked to do a sort of physical placement, empirical thing where somebody else needed some interviews with Sephardi Jews to compare to some Aboriginal transmission of trauma studies this guy at RMIT was doing. So I got involved in doing these Sephardi interviews. I was told that it was all going to be organised and I would just turn up and interview these people. Turned out it wasn't organised, and I had to contact some of these people, and I had to write a 6,000 word paper. That was part of the master's. So I did all that, and then I didn't worry about it for a while, and one of my tutors said, you should keep going and do a PhD. And I thought, oh, do I need this now? And who wants to spend 3 years concentrating on something, intensely, when I sort of can't concentrate on one thing? I thought it'd be much easier to do a few more interviews and put a book together. And the tutor said, yeah, you should publish this because no one else has interviewed these people. And it's original research. So if you do this, you'll probably be able to get a book out of it. So I didn't do the 3 years PhD because I thought that'd be too long and too involved. So it only took me another 9 or 10 years to finish all these interviews and get this book finally published. So that's
I mean, just the simple task of publishing a book is an incredible thing, and this is your second book. We'll talk about that in a moment.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that as you kind of hinted to me, and hinted a bit earlier, the task of getting the book published had its fair share of headaches and challenges. So first off, yashar koach and just publishing a book, because doing that is an incredible thing on its own. What were some of the challenges that came up in terms of getting access to the interviewees and you know,
Yeah.
and language issues? I mean, did you find issues on that level?
Well, I have interviewed a lot of people before. I interviewed people for my first book, and I interviewed Holocaust survivors in the 90s for the Spielberg project. Luckily, I was introduced to a lady, Vivian Levy, who's a member, Egyptian background, a member of the Sephardi community.
That's at Sassoon Yehuda. Is she there? Is that at that shul or?
Vivian Levy, she's at the Sassoon Yehuda shul. Yeah. I think she was even the president at one stage. But she was very nice and very helpful, and I interviewed her and her husband, and they were both quite important in forming that shul. You know, they helped create that shul back in the early days. And I interviewed them. They both sort of grew up in Egypt and had interesting stories. And then they got me some other names. Basically, I rang up people, tried to explain who I was and what I was doing. And amazingly, most were okay. Had a couple of refusals, but most were okay. It was hard because a lot of the people in Melbourne are Egyptian, and I needed more sort of variety. I mean, it's really sad that no one didn't do this 20 years ago, because there were people at that shul from probably more than 24 countries, Jews from all over the world, of that sort of Sephardi or Mizrach background. But anyway, I got a few more from, trying to think from where, from a few other countries. And one interesting thing is I wanted someone from Greece, because people don't normally think of, you know, Greek Jews and know much about them, and couldn't find somebody. Actually, I think it might have been Jacques Dessau gave me a number of a woman who I rang, but she was born in Greece, in Salonika, but she left when she was 3 months old, so she couldn't really tell me anything. However, two things came up. One was that I discovered a lady who did grow up in Salonika, who lived about 3 blocks from me in Ormond. And also I discovered Shlomo Parahia, our member from Blake Street. So I spoke to those two people, and I spoke to that lady and then her sister eventually, who's a pretty important interviewee in the book because she survived Auschwitz. And eventually I got those, I went and interviewed those people either on video or with a sound recorder, but I didn't have enough. And then, I'm not sure how it happened, I accidentally met someone at a function at Monash Uni who was a teacher from Sydney, and a guy called Myer Samra. We send our emails to each other, hello Myer and bye Myer, who is, I think he's Iraqi background, or he's did a PhD on Egyptian Jews or something. Anyway, they became my contacts in Sydney, and roughly, you know, we had some friends in Sydney that had bar mitzvahs and weddings and things, and so each time I went up to Sydney, I organised to interview these people. I rang them and schlepped around Sydney by train, by car, whatever, to their places, and eventually got these interviews done. It was sort of, all this was over a number of years. So I didn't work on this continuously. I had in that same time, actually in the same time that all this happened, I've had 2 kids get married and 4 grandchildren born. So there are other things in life that take up your time, thankfully good things. But eventually I had enough. You know, at first I thought I wouldn't get enough interviews, and then eventually I had enough. And then after I finished, after I sort of had enough, a couple of dozen, I had various people contact me saying, oh, you know, you could speak to this person, or you could interview me or whatever, but I just couldn't do any more, you know. Sydney was very good because Sydney has people from Libya and Iraq, which weren't in Melbourne. So I got a reasonable spread there. And there are a lot more interesting people, but you can't do them all. There's apparently a guy in Perth, I think his name's Cohen, who didn't leave Iraq till very late. He was jailed or tortured or something by Saddam Hussein's people and got out only more recently. But I know of him, but I've never met him or had a chance. If I had unlimited resources, I would have gone to Adelaide or Perth. Now, I think this is my kids ringing from America. I'll just tell them to ring back later, all right? Oh no, my wife's picked it up on the iPad. Okay, all right, because they're getting a bit stir crazy in Chicago. They've been in their house for 9 weeks. They got onto this very early and decided we're not taking any chances. And yeah, they're stuck at home there with their 3 kids aged from 2 to 7. So they're going crazy, but they're surviving. Okay, so I did these interviews. I transcribed them. I actually had an acquaintance transcribe the last few because I just couldn't bear typing anymore and doing it. And then I had to get back to them because, of course, when you sit there for an hour and a half or so, you forget things, or things are out of order, or there's things that are a bit confusing or you couldn't hear on the tape. So all those people, including the 9 or so in Sydney, at some stage I went back to them, some of them 2 or 3 times, most of them only twice, I think, just to clarify things. So I had to speak to them again. Unfortunately, a couple of them passed away because they're in their 80s and 90s. Their families helped a bit. Myer Harari, who's a guy from Egypt who's quite a character that a lot of people in Melbourne used to know, fortunately, he sort of wrote a book about his own life story. It was very handy to get a few extra facts out of his book that I sort of put into the interviews. But yeah, it's a lot of time. It's a lot of time going through this and organising and editing, and the intro is basically a sort of a rewrite of some university essays. Didn't want to waste all that effort, writing those essays, but I had to update it and add a lot of stuff. So and various people, gave me information, academics, historians, friends, people criticised. So got to a stage where I thought it's ready. And what else can I say? Yeah, and I've had this experience before. You send stuff out and you get your rejections, and at least that's a beginning. But this time I sensed that it wasn't going to happen because mainstream publishers aren't interested in this sort of topic. They only want to know if something will sell 20,000 copies so they can print it off and, make tens of thousands of dollars. So in the end, I went with, I'd spoken to some people at McCaw because they have that publishing arm. They publish those memory guide my hand, or whatever, stories of people. And so I worked with them and various people that they work with, editors, book designers, etc. And that wasn't an easy or smooth process, but eventually we got to a stage where we could actually print the final copy and luckily do it, because we planned, the original plan for the launch was November, I think, or October, but then things weren't ready. And then one of the old interviewees was on a cruise and said, I want to be there and, I don't want to miss out. So we put it off another week. Then the shul had a function that week, so it couldn't be that week. And then it got to December and Christmas, so it couldn't be that week, too late. And then it ended up being moved from early Feb to February 23rd or 27th or something. And we finally did it. And a lot of interest was shown. It was very good to have a big crowd at the shul there. It was very good. Yeah.
That seems like years ago already.
Yeah, I know it is. And it's sort of, and I haven't managed to get it into, I think Gold's and the Jewish Museum have got some copies, and I was negotiating with readings, but everything is on hold. I was actually going to go to Sydney too. The Sydney Jewish Museum has apparently an amazing exhibition called Jews from Arab Lands. And that was going to be launched, I think, March, and I was going to go up there then. And that launch was cancelled because it was already the beginning of the restrictions. So I'm hoping they'll have it later in the year. And I'll go up to Sydney, I guess, and sort of have some sort of mini launch there, because a third of the people in the book are from Sydney. So, and Sydney's, for people who don't know, Sydney's got quite a more substantial Sephardi community, you could say. A lot more Jews from the Middle East. And they've got the shul and they have functions and fortunately have a lot more numbers. Can I just say 2 things while we're talking about all this? One is that, and it says it in the intro to the book, that Sephardi is just a term I've used as by default, because otherwise you'd be talking about Mizrach and Romaniots and all sorts of different Jews. So a lot of the people in this book and a lot of the people we're talking about are not really of Sephardi origin, because if some of those ladies in Sydney who lived in Iraq, their families had probably been in Iraq for thousands of years. They were there from the beginning. They were never in Spain or anywhere else. But I just use the word, as a general sort of term, which is explained in the book. And the other thing I say to people when talking about this is that when you look at some of the subject matter in the book, that we should think of our Ashkenazi backgrounds and think of our parents and grandparents that grew up either in shtetls or in the big cities, Warsaw, Lodge, whatever, that keeping that sort of European background in mind it makes what's in the book sort of stand out more because it's so different. Yeah. It's so different. People don't realise that difference. I didn't know much about Sephardi Jews probably till I became an adult. I just knew there were Jews that, I don't know, lived in the Middle East, and in my whole, I don't know what they taught in the Jewish day schools, but my education from Sunday school and other Jewish education was that the Jews were kicked out of Spain in 1492, and that's about all I knew. Yeah. So it's been a good learning experience.
And there seems to be a bit of frustration on the part of, you know, again, for the, using your term, of Sephardi Jews, of being somewhat invisible in Australian Jewish history. I mean, that seems to be something that's coming up in the memoirs.
Yeah, according to some of the research, I think by Rabbi Levy and a few other people, that of the convicts on that first fleet in 1788, I think the numbers vary, but it's like 12 to 14 or something Jews were on those first boats, and quite a few of them had Portuguese or Spanish surnames. So it's some historians say that they were the first Sephardi Jews in Australia. And a few more came out in the 1800s, mainly to South Australia, and were quite significant, I think, in sort of industry or farming, whatever, but they had small numbers. They couldn't sort of really build anything up. They didn't have enough, or they got absorbed in the wider community. Most of the people of that background came here in the 50s and 60s, you know, after the Arab countries expelled them. The other thing to remember when discussing all this is that it's not a matter of saying one is better or more important than the other. It's just that it's a significant part of Jewish history. And if you people who study, you know, look at those, there's a number of quite, you know, well-known books on history of Jews in Australia by the Rubensteins and someone else's names I've forgotten at the moment. But and they do, some of them do mention a little bit. Some say there were Jews from Egypt, you know, who didn't speak Yiddish or something, and who, you know, who settled here. But there's not much detail. And when you speak to these people, they say, look, we've got a long history and a rich history, and you know, we've been through good times and bad times. Some of them were in the Holocaust. There is this trend sometimes people say, oh, Sephardi Jews, you know, they escaped the Holocaust, but they didn't. And that, I mean, some of the people I spoke to had that sort of feeling that they feel in some way that they're not quite accepted or treated equally. There's a fair bit of stuff that didn't make it in the book because people didn't want it in there. I mean, some people may know about this, but years and years back when the Sephardi shul, they started off in a house in Malvern, I think in the 60s, there were some issues between the Sephardi community and the Jewish community and the Jewish Board of Deputies, and there was various politics and broiguses and all sorts of things happened, but in the end they came together again. It's sort of like people who grew up in Egypt and Iraq and all these sort of places, they said to me that they, you know, they read the Jewish news, they see the films, the literature. There's fantastic stuff in Australia on you know, every aspect of Jewish life in Australia has been recorded, filmed, documented. You know, literature, movies, docos, academic books, fantastic. There's a lot of great stuff out there, and they don't see themselves in that. And they've said, we rarely get a mention, our history doesn't get a mention. So that's why they wanted to talk about their backgrounds and growing up. And that's why I say, if hopefully people you'll read their interviews, you'll see that what they talk about, how they grew up in Egypt, Iraq, etc., is very different to how our parents, grandparents grew up in Poland or Russia. It's a really different lifestyle, a different attitude to Judaism, and really interesting as well. Yeah, so... All right.
Yes. So it's, you know, obviously an important task to kind of preserve that legacy and heritage and that important part of Australian history. So that's a really, really special thing that you did. What are some of the surprising the stories that really stand out? Some of the personalities that really stand out in your mind?
Well, I'll start with one that'll be interesting for you. We know the rabbi's job is hard. He's got to deal with the community, lots of issues. But I'll tell you,
not to mention managing Zoom. I mean, that's like the.
Well, I'll tell you what Rabbi Perez in Sydney had to handle. Right, very nice fellow. He's probably in his early to mid 70s, I think. He was born in in Tunisia. And he grew up in Tunisia in a Jewish community, religious, everything very good. There was some violence and things against the Jews, but generally where he was, I've forgotten the city, things were good. When he was still in his teens, he won a scholarship to go to London to get a better Jewish education. There was some scheme to bring the Jews from those Arab countries to study. Anyway, the short of it is, at 21, he finished the studies. He had to learn English. He knew Hebrew, he knew Arabic, he knew a bit of French, but he finished the studies. So at 21, they said, you can go and be study or teach. He wanted to be a teacher. He hadn't become a rabbi yet. You can go to Australia or South Africa, I think, but they couldn't afford to send him to Australia. So they sent him to what was then Rhodesia. So he got to Rhodesia at the time that the government was changing. They're getting rid of the British government, and Mugabe and the other native people were taking over. And when he got there, the principal of the Jewish school had left, because he left because of the political conditions. So Rabbi Perez, he wasn't a rabbi, he was just a guy who studied Judaism, was told, well, you can teach and you can be the principal. And he said, but I'm only 21. I've only done theory, I've only practiced. They said, doesn't matter. You've got to be the principal of the school. We don't have anyone. And you attend to the religious needs as well, because there's no one to run the minyan and do all those things in the community. So he said, well, that was a bit of a shock, but he did it. And he developed the school and he taught. He obviously had some skills, but this is the bit you'll probably like. What happened was they did have an Ashkenazi community and some Sephardi Jews that had got there. In fact, Jews from Rhodes also, those who escaped before the war, ended up in Salisbury, in Harare. Anyway, what happened was the Ashkenazi rabbi left as well because of the political situation. So they didn't have anyone. So Rabbi Perez used to run the service on Saturday morning for a group of the Sephardi Jews in the Sephardi Nusach, etc. Then he would run across to the Ashkenazi shul and do a bit of davening and give the same sermon there. If there was a bar mitzvah, he did that sort of thing. And I can't remember now, it's in the book, but I think for about 6 months, he ran between shuls on Saturdays, trying to run both services. There's a job for you. Anyway, and in brief, look, he did very well there, and he ended up in Namibia, where he started off a Jewish school that was very successful. Then I think South Africa, and via various things that happened, via Perth, he ended up in Sydney, and he became the rabbi of, I think, Maroubra Shul, which was an Ashkenazi shul, and he was there for 25 years and retired a few years ago. But that was an interesting life. But equally interesting is another fellow in Melbourne, Isaac Menashe. He was born in Rhodes, was only there for a short time. Rhodes is a Greek island, and his family went to they went to Rhodesia as well, I think. And when he was 12, they went back to Rhodes because he met his grandparents and other family members. His parents hadn't been back for 10 years. And what happened? He spoke English, a bit of English, and I guess a bit of Hebrew or some bit of Greek or whatever. Anyway, what happened was he had some friends there that were tourist guides. They used to take British tourists around, but these people only spoke Ladino, didn't speak enough English. So this 12-year-old guy and his brother became tourist guides, and the Jewish guys would tell them what the sites were in Ladino, and then they would translate it to English for the tourists. And he said that was one of his more interesting memories, which I think for a young kid to do that sort of thing is pretty amazing. And look, the other people talked about growing up in places like Morocco, Egypt, even Iraq, where they had sort of idyllic childhoods. They mixed with the locals, they adapted. Marcel Levy, she's the first person in the book, and very interesting lady now in her mid-90s. She talks about having, they weren't well off, but they used to sit outside in the heat and tell stories and play with each other. And there was no radio, no TV, no computers, none of that sort of thing, but it was just people relating to each other. And it was a very beautiful time until, things changed later. So the other thing about it is too, you get stories of people from Europe, and they're really good and important too, but there tends to be a bit of a, what's the right word, a theme there. You've either grown up in a shtetl or a big city, and Jewish life has had its ups and downs, and then it's either getting out before the Holocaust or, ghettos, Holocaust, displaced camps coming to Australia. With some of these people, even from the same country, there's differences. People had differences in their upbringing, in how they practiced their Judaism, and how they got to Australia. Some came by very circuitous routes. That's what makes it. That's what I found interesting, because I know a bit about my parents' background, but these people often had different stories. There's a guy who grew up in Sydney who grew up in Libya, and that was really interesting too. He was born after the war, but he grew up in Libya, and it wasn't very pleasant at all. His story shows that it wasn't good for Jews in Libya, and it's certainly not. He doesn't think anyone would go back there, but it was very different to other people. And so I found it very interesting, because it wasn't my story; it was somebody else. And it was interesting. So, and it's interesting to know. It's also part of Australian migration history. We have so many migration groups here, and it's often talked about where they've come from. And there's the Migration Museum. There's all these things, and the Jewish story is a big part of that. But it's only one part of the Jewish story. That the Jews from the Arab lands aren't are barely mentioned. That's what they say to me. And and there have been some memoirs published, and there has been a little bit of academic work, but very sort of singular, odd articles and things. A couple of good memoirs from Sydney and Melbourne, a little bit of a few academic articles in the 80s, 90s or so, but not a lot in the last sort of so many years, and certainly not a lot of stuff on Holocaust related stuff. And a lot of the international Sephardi scholars, stuff you come across, they talk about that. They say that the Sephardi experience of the Holocaust has been minimized in a lot of the histories, because it's all very European, and because of the numbers of Jews killed.
Is that just a numbers game, or is there something else?
The American guys, people that I read, I think it was American. No, they say it's because of the numbers. I think it's 160,000. I can't remember out of my head, but there were, substantial Sephardi people killed. There was a Sephardi community in Hamburg that had been there a long time, which people don't know about. So they suffered the same fate. It's the numbers. The people that wrote the histories were of European background, the biggest historians. It's the numbers and the scale of, it all happened in Europe, and it's the emphasis is on that. But it was happening in North Africa, Greece especially. Greece was one of the worst cases. Salonika, 96% of the population was wiped out, and also the Greek islands. It showed how fanatical and shocking the Nazis were. They went to those extent of hunting every Jew on these little rocks in the Mediterranean, and they got a lot of them. That's what the historians say, that it's really the emphasis on Europe. And although it's not denied or anything, it's sort of only mentioned as a footnote that some Sephardi Jews, but things happened in Morocco, in all across in North Africa, Egypt, and also there was Einsatzgruppen, the shooting squads. They were in North Africa waiting to get into Egypt and then Palestine. They were going to do there what they did in Eastern Europe, but luckily the Allies landing in the north and the defeat of Rommel sort of stopped that. Prevented that happening. Otherwise, it would have been even more tragic. So it's all interesting history. I'm into history a lot. I think history is really important. You learn from it, and it helps explain things today.
They did get to Libya, actually, and they were already sending boats from Libya of Jews. And I think one of the lucky things for the North African communities was that the Germans, with all their Chokhmah, they decided actually to transfer the Jews to Auschwitz.
Yeah.
Instead of doing something local. And that's what created that big delay. And actually my mother, she lived in Morocco, and I was also born in Morocco, but my mother, she they got to her town, and you know how it happens, that they get in first, and then they taking all the notes and all the list of all the people and all that, and then they starting, and they actually were at that stage when the American came over, and got rid of all that. And so I think the Sephardis were lucky, but there are things that still surprise me. I mean, I was born in Morocco. I'm Sephardi Jew, and I don't buy German products. While Ashkenazis have no problem to drive a Merc or to drive a BMW and use gold.
Only if it's the car that you drive, you know.
No, it's interesting.
Yeah,
go on. No, I was going to say, it's interesting what you say. Now, I've come across a couple of references, and I'm not 100% sure how accurate this is, but I have come across these things, and there's disagreement amongst some of the historians I've looked at, but some say there is evidence that the Nazis were planning to build gas chambers somewhere near the Tunisian-Algerian border or somewhere, that these were just plans, but they never had the chance to start. Now, one historian, Satloff, he says this is I forgot the phrase he used, a sort of a memory, a sort of an assumption out of memory that things were happening so much that you assumed that was part of the reality as well. Other people have said, no, there's definitely evidence of it. Now, I can't say 100%, but I do quote that in the book that there was that idea. But even after the Nazis left, though, there were other issues. I mean, in Libya, there were pogroms against the Jews. In other areas, there were problems as well. It wasn't just the Nazis, it was the Arabs as well. And those communities, as you know, were there for a long time. You know, they'd been there for hundreds of years, if not even longer. Yeah, I have this dream. I don't know when it can happen now, but I would like to visit some of those places in North Africa. I'm lucky that when my son went to, when my kids were in Israel in 2014, we went to Israel, but it's a long way to go for 2 weeks. So we took did a bit of an extra tour. I went to Turkey, and also I went to the Greek islands of Kos and Rhodes. And Rhodes I would recommend for people to go to, because there's still the Jewish quarter is still there. Unfortunately, not many Jews, but it was interesting to see the places where the Jews had lived and the type of community and the type of places they lived in. And I'd like to visit a few places in North Africa to sort of photograph those remains and do that as well. But I don't know how safe it is even when there isn't a virus, and I'm not sure when or if that's going to happen, but that's a little aim for the future. Try and get to Morocco and Algeria, Tunisia, yeah.
So I'm wondering if anybody has any questions now, we can kind of open things. Yeah, does anybody have any questions that they want to, I see Les has, it's not Les, that's probably not Les.
I'm Linda. I'm Linda.
Hi, Linda.
I'm Linda Harari. My parents are Myer and Lulu Harari, the late. Someone mentioned that my dad's name was mentioned earlier on in this. Yes. I didn't know anything about this, and I didn't
You're Myer's daughter.
I'm Myer's daughter.
Sorry, I knew Claudine quite well, like way from Having days. But I'm sorry that I wasn't.
It's actually her yard site today. I'm just looking at.
I'm sorry that I wasn't aware of you.
I
know. I aware to the extent that Myer listed his kids and what they were doing, but I didn't mention.
Well, I'm the fourth. I'm the fourth in line.
Okay, right.
So sorry, I missed the beginning, and I assume that you've written a book about the Sephardi Jews or something. Yeah. So I'm coming in at the end of it all.
That's all right.
So. Yes, I'm very interested in what you said about the Jews of Egypt. My parents are both born there. My dad was Sephardi. My mum was Ashkenazi. So we're a mixture, and we've always lived an Ashkenazi life here in Melbourne. Sorry, I don't know if this is of interest to anybody else. So I was just curious where you're coming from and what you've said. My dad used to talk a lot about his childhood and what it was like growing up in Egypt, and it was, and on one hand, it was an idyllic sort of lifestyle, but there was always an undertone, he said, of something of discomfort, and he had a few recollections as a child. He remembers in 1929, for example, that he was 9 years old in 1929, and he saw his father put a pistol, as he called it, a gun.
Yeah.
He had to put it under his bed, and he kept it hidden. And so there were the Arab riots. There were the riots in
Hebron.
No, in Israel.
Oh, in Egypt.
In
Alexandria?
in Palestine at the time. There were riots going on in 1929, which would have corresponded to a lot of unrest in the rest of the Middle Eastern countries. And he used to, he used to talk about moments in his life where he felt where there was uncertainty and a lot of concern in his childhood, that is. But generally, they were safe, they were happy. But there was always an undertone of, well, we're just visitors here, sort of thing.
Yeah, that's what made him want to leave, because he went to the didn't he go to the authorities to complain about, I think, his cousin being arrested or something, and then when they said we don't even know if he's really British, he decided this is not a place for us. He had a British passport, and he was they lived in threat of losing their British passports and being stuck there. And when he went to renew it one time, they said, oh well, that's the last time, we're not going to renew this anymore. And he came home and said to my mum, we're out of here, basically. And they had a 1-year-old child, my brother Edwin, and they left then and there in 48. But I think there was a lot of very unsettling times there, certainly around just before the creation of Israel and around that time, which was very, very frightening for them. Yeah, he talks about that, and so does your uncle Raymond. I interviewed him as well. But Meyer's story is pretty interesting. He sort of makes some very pointed comments. There's a bit of humour or sarcasm there about a few things. But I know. I'll just say I liked. I did only see him twice, and when I wanted to speak to him again, he was already, not so well. But he always started off each session with anyone called Myer is either really good looking or really intelligent or something like that. So it was good to visit him. But fortunately, there were a couple of things that weren't clear about what he told me. But he had that book. He wrote his own book. Well, the book was written years ago, and the first bit was sort of historically quite interesting, and then the second bit he lost it a bit, and he didn't give it to anyone to sort of go over it and review it for him. Which unfortunately, he just sort of wrote all these weird anecdotes that that upset us a lot. But he'd already But it was published in Macaw, Yeah, that's right. Well, that was my auntie Julie Meadows, Julie Harari, who's my I know. Yeah.
She was doing it at the time, but there wasn't much input from any of us. And at that stage, he was too busy sort of telling stories and jokes. Then anyway, not the point. Well, it does anyway. It is a story of an Australian Jew who grew up in Egypt, and also what's interesting for other people to know is that he's related to the people involved in the Damascus affair in the 1840s or whatever. So there is that, the Hararis have an interesting history, which comes out in the book. Sorry, I happen to have my window that faces sort of north. The sun is coming through, which is why I'm turning white. And I can't control the sun. It was also interesting that you mentioned about the Sephardi shul here in Melbourne, because my uncle, on the other side, on my mother's side, was one of the early founders of that, the one in Darling Road in East Malvern. Who and they had a go at that for a while, and it didn't take off very well for some reason. And then their whole family went off and went to Temple Beth as their main shul. So, and by the time they rebuilt the Sephardi shul in Hotham Street, my uncle and his family had sort of branched away from that. So we never had any connection whatsoever with the Sephardi shul. Yeah. I think if it had been around at the time when my dad arrived in Australia, then we would have gone there. My dad was a very regular shul goer, but we ended up going to Caulfield Shul. There were a couple of people that interviewed that actually either came here and the shul wasn't there then, or they ended up going to Caulfield or the liberal side of things. And in the book, a couple of the people, it might be Morris Levy, I can't remember, they talk about how and why they set up that shul in Malvern. And then, they wanted a rabbi to live there, but it was a bit removed from the centre of Jewish life. That's right. So that's why they then bought this place in Hotham Street, because they thought they'd be in the centre. But interesting to know also, as the old 2 Jews, 3 opinions, that even amongst such a small group, there was a bit of a split. And apparently, I presume still, there are a small group of Sephardi Jews that daven across the road in the Chabad, in the yeshiva. Because the ones that... No, not in the yeshiva. They moved to Carlisle Street. Carlisle Street, They set up their own... Because Hotham Street wasn't religious enough for them. No, it was... they were doing some renovation, and then they moved to the opposite side, and the opposite side, they just took it down. I think Albert I think Albert Dadon set up a Sephardi shul as well, another offshoot, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, there was. I tried to speak to some of those people, but I didn't get much response. But anyway, I got a few in Melbourne.
I'm wondering.
Sorry, I was going to say there were a few other people I spoke to who aren't in the book, but for various reasons. But yeah, there were some pretty interesting stories, especially comments by some of the women. They had a bit. Some of the older ladies had a bit to say about, let's say, their status back in those sort of traditional societies. Their status wasn't particularly high. They had a few comments to make about their role, how they were, married off young, whether you wanted to or not, and often the person was older and stuff like that. So there's some interesting comments there by some of the women about.
Myer, I have a kind of an idea that it just came up to me reading a bit about and listening also to some podcasts between the 10th and the 14th, 15th century, and lehavdil, as they say. When we look at also the other religions, I think the Christianity went through dark ages in the early. Between the 10th, 12th, 14th, 15th century, and slowly coming out of it. I mean, there was always anti-Semitism, there was always extremism, and I think like now, the way it looks to me is a bit the Islam is going a bit through kind of dark ages, with ISIS and all that, and whatever is happening in the Middle East. I think when we're looking at it from the Judaism point of view, I think the Sephardi side of Judaism had their golden ages, between the 8th, 10th, up to the 14th, 15th century. And they were the base for all the Ashkenazi literature and all the Ashkenazi. If you look at the Rambam, we look at the Rif, and we look at who actually were the base for
all the Kabbalistic,
practically.
Yeah.
And from the 15th, 16th century, I think the Ashkenazi started their golden ages. And I think now we're getting into, because we have the country, we have Israel and everyone, and now actually in the last few years, the majority, the number, going through numbers, the majority of Jews now actually live in Israel. And there, even though there was a bit of, let's say, at the beginning, at the establishment of Israel, there was a lot of not only stories, a lot of, I'm not going to say racism, but a lot of aflaya. I don't know how you.
Some of the people talk about that.
Yeah. And but now it's getting to the point that it's kind of getting to an equilibrium in Israel between the Sephardis and the Ashkenazis. Even if you look at the government, you have Shas in one side, and then you have Agudat Israel on the other side. So I think now with Israel, you put them all together, it has to come out something beautiful has to come out of it. That's the way I see it.
Yeah. Well, some of the interviewees did spend time in Israel before and after 48, and some of them had no problems and said it just depended where and when you were, but a few of them did talk about that Ashkenazi attitude that was not very positive towards them. But it's
the one of the Sephardi, but they're not so much Sepharadis. They Edot Teman. They have totally different experiences and totally different stories. And they were even kind of neglected by the Sephardis because they were all the way out there in Asia somewhere.
Which ones are you saying?
The Yemenites.
The Yemenites, yeah. Yeah, Yemenites entirely separate. Yeah, I would have liked to have had someone of Yemenite background, but I didn't come across anyone at my time. But that history is really interesting about the history of Jews in
there was
Yemen.
There's a story, actually. I mean, not a story. There was the Yemenites, a very specific period of time. I think it was at the 11th century. They were actually made to convert to Islam, all of them. And they sent a letter to the Rambam telling him, look, either we convert or we die.
Yeah.
So he told them, because it's Islam and it's not Christianity, you can convert. But in the heart, you will always be Jews.
Yeah, and then he said later...
Islam and Judaism, they believe in Allah. They believe in God. They don't believe in any person that suddenly became the son of God or anything like that.
Or trinities or anything, yeah.
But
then, and then later...
sorry,
I think later
Myer.
he said they could be reaccepted. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the famous Igeret HaTeman, the letter to Teman, to Yemen.
Yeah.
We've got to wrap it up in the next couple of minutes because I've got to move on to my next Zoom meeting. I just wanted to also just give people an opportunity to know about you. Actually, this is your second book. You wrote an earlier book called "Does God Live in the Suburbs?" So maybe if you could just take a moment to let people know about that book and what that was all about.
Well, again, that was not 100% intentional, but there'd been some anti-Semitic stuff had arisen somewhere, and there was a local councillor that made some stupid comments about the Jews. And I wrote a letter to the paper saying, well, why doesn't he get a book and read how Jews live? And he'd realised what he said was stupid. And I found that there was plenty of books on the history, philosophy, religion, all that sort of stuff of religions in Australia. There wasn't anything about what people how they live, their daily lives. So I don't know how, but somehow I started interviewing all these people from different religions, did a bit of research, contacted them. I had done a unit at Monash 50 years ago on sociology of religion, so a little bit of background. And I ended up, that also took a lot of years, compiling all these interviews, and then a small publisher, independent publisher, published that, which was quite good. I got some good royalties for a number of years. It's already 12 years or something. But yeah, it gives you a bit of a insight into how your neighbours live, whether they're Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu, whatever, just the mainstream ones. And that was an achievement. I think this is a more significant sort of achievement. I'll just say two quick things. One is I'm just actually this afternoon going to drop off a copy to someone in Paran. Anyone that wants a copy, you can get in touch with me and I'm happy to drive it over or drop it off or something. And the other thing is Michael, isn't it? The Moroccan guy. It's Michael, yeah?
Michael, yeah.
Michael, yeah. When he mentions that golden age, that's a whole other topic. And I do mention that in the intro there. And there are two specific books. One is a book about how the Jews, Christians and Muslims created a society of, intercultural mixing. And the other book is saying it was the exact opposite. It wasn't a golden age. You have to read both those books. There is no clear sort of idea. But the basic conclusion is there were small golden periods where things were okay, but they were interrupted there were still massacres and things in the Sephardi areas, but not the continuous demonization like of Christian Europe. Okay.
So I know obviously you're still in the, basking in the glory of this book. Do you have any thoughts to any future project, something you're interested in working in?
Yeah, well, it's, these things take 10 times as long as you think. Look, I went to Monash on a research trip. I went with Monash on a research trip in 2009 or 10 as part of my master's work, and went to Eastern Europe, Germany, Prague, Lithuania, various places, and photographed a lot of Jewish sites, a couple of the old wooden synagogues, Jewish buildings, etc. And then I did that same thing in Kos and Rhodes, Turkey. And I would really like to there's some beautiful Sephardi shuls in the former Yugoslavia, Croatia, places like Croatia and Bosnia. And also, as I said, North Africa. Someone here's mentioned Jerba, which I know about. A lot of shuls that have been there for hundreds of years. I'd like to photograph those places, and I've actually been sort of collecting bits and pieces of literature that relate to some of those places, and writing a few things myself. I'm pretty good at summarizing things and writing essays, and that's sort of all the stuff I've done in an interview, but I'd really like to do something where I write the stuff myself, the creative stuff and my feelings about these places. I think I had a thing in the Jewish News a couple of things in the Jewish News about my travels to Poland once, but this is sort of a long-term thing that I'm not working on every day. It's just something that as the opportunity arises, hopefully I'll get to some of those places. My son was supposed to go to Israel in August to see his father-in-law. I was thinking of going there and doing more stuff, but I don't think in a few months we're going to be ready to do that. So it might have to wait a bit longer, but I've got, having sort of disposed of work, I suppose, I'm more flexible and I can do, things at my own time. And and I've got to go to America every year to see my grandkids. So somehow I fit the travel in around that. But I've got some ideas for things I'm going to write, some little stories or something. And I'm very slow, and I don't stick at it long enough, but I get it done just over a period of time. That's just the way I work. These sort of, you hear about these writers that get up at 5 a.m. and write for 6-8 hours a day and all that sort of thing. That's not me. You know, I've got to go for my walk and then make some lunch, clean up this room behind me that's a disgusting mess for the last 10 years. There's a lot of things to do. I'm pretty busy. So, and also, see, my kids just rang from Chicago. We normally talk to them a couple of mornings a week. So, yeah, I'll just keep doing my research and reading, and yeah, something may happen, but it won't happen for a few years.
Well, if someone wants to have a look at your book, how does one do that? You
contact me, and I'm happy to drop it off if you live within about a 10-kilometre radius of Caulfield or Ormond.
I do.
Gold's has got copies, and so has the Jewish Museum, but of course it's not opening up yet. But I have plenty of copies. I don't know, get my phone number or email, and I'm happy to.
Could I? How do I do that now? From here. I'd like to.
Yeah, how can we give people my details?
Well, why don't you, just tell me your email address. I'll put it in the chat there, Linda, if you just take a look.
Yeah. My email's not that hard. It's MY and then Bloom backwards. So it's MY MOOLB. MY MOOLB at gmail.com.
Okay. Thank you.
If you email me, give me your details, I'll get in touch with you. And
okay.
Myer, I thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
Thank you for letting me rave on about
it. No, it's our pleasure, and you know, so you've done a really wonderful thing there, and you biggest Sharkov too. And we thank you for your time, and also you've kindly donated a copy to the Shul Library as well, which is very kind of you. And we appreciate your work, and we wish you continued success moving forward in all of your creative endeavors.
Thank you.
And also health to the whole family wherever they are.
Thank you.
So Aaron just said, how can we get a copy of the recording? I will please God put a copy of this recording up either in the Shul newsletter or on the Shul website. We'll sort something out like that.
All right,
yeah, it's been recorded. Also, next week, please God, we'll continue, and we'll be meeting with Dr. Paul Gardner, who's also just published a book.
Yeah, his book's very good.
So
what's that
again,
about?
we're trying to. Well, you have to come next week. You got to get on the. You got to get on the Shul website, the Shul newsletter, and we'll let people know about that. But I unfortunately do have to call it right here. But I thank you so much, Myer, for your time, and thank you all for joining us this morning.
Yeah.
And have a fantastic day. What do you want to say, Myer?
Just thank you for Monday. That was a logistical masterpiece to be able to organise all that.
It was more like a logistical nightmare, but we got there in the end.
No, thank you. Yeah, it was interesting. It was good. Well, thanks very much for letting me talk about it. Yep.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Myer and Rabbi Sendor. Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
See you later.